Hi, my name is John Lyons, and this is my workshop, Heartwood and Steel. And today, we're making a medicine cabinet. I first met David and Cindy through my wife. Barbara and Cindy share a number of crafting interests like polymer clay and sewing. Cindy and David are both really wonderful people, and knowing that I had their full buy-in to make custom medicine cabinets for their recent bathroom remodel was such a huge boost for my confidence.
Do you want John to make the medicine cabinets for the bathroom?
Well, how bad could it be?
I used to be a graphic designer, so I'm most comfortable showing a proof design to my customers before I start buying materials and building anything. Using my newly acquired CAD skills, I roughed out the cabinet design and got their approval to start work. David brought me the old cabinets that the builder removed while I was working on another project, so I pulled the old cabinets out of storage and compared my draft to the boxes that previously filled the holes in their bathroom walls. I found a great plugin for Fusion 360 that creates my cut list, but I didn't create my panels in a way that the software knew that I was gluing those panels from narrow sections of lumber. So I needed to do a little extra math to make sure I calculated my board feet correctly for the panel insets. I made everything out of solid maple to match the new vanities that their contractor put in. It was common to place medicine cabinets in the wall between the studs, but apparently that option is less common with newer cabinets, and the vendor who made the vanity didn't make a matching unit for in-wall placement. After realizing my sled wasn't supporting the board well, I started breaking the boards down with a handsaw first. Panel glue-ups are the natural consequences of narrow boards. Since I fudged that detail in Fusion 360, I started by assessing how the back panels were going to look after I glued them together. Since the panels are behind a closed door and the stuff stored in the cabinets, going 3 boards wide wouldn't be so bad, as long as the seams weren't highlighting dramatically different boards. And with 2 identical cabinets, everything I did had to be done twice. So I cross-cut the boards for the back panels, then I ripped the rough edges off, and then I resawed everything at the bandsaw for 6 1/4-inch thick boards. I took all the parts to the planer and planed the carcass parts to 3/4 of an inch thick, and the panel parts to exactly 1/4 of an inch thick. It was about this time that I realized that my sled wasn't quite as square as I thought it was. The shim near the curve in the sled was enough to correct the problem. Then I cut the carcass sides to length, and I trimmed the parts for the back panels. Finally, I cut rabbets on the back edges of the carcass parts to accommodate the back panel insert. Using my bench vise and jointer plane, I jointed the pieces for the back panels. Because they don't work well for anything thinner than about 1/2 inch, I cut some plywood scraps as spacers for my panel clamps, and I tested to make sure that I had good contact on all sides. Then, I waxed the wood surfaces on the clamps and spacers, and I glued up the panels and applied clamping pressure. I get my first look at the progress I've made with the carcass. From flat lumber to a dry fit of all the pieces, including the back panels, and it looks pretty good. Since this cabinet is going to live between the studs and the walls, any attempt at fine joinery would be pointless, except to stoke my ego, which is big enough already, so I drilled pocket holes for quick and sturdy construction. Before drilling the holes for the shelf pins, I realized that I could use a magnetic mount for my action camera, right on the drill press. There's probably a dozen ways to drill these holes, but I decided to go this way partly because it was one of the few horizontal surfaces in my shop that wasn't covered in stuff that had to be put away. With the carcasses ready for assembly, I turned my attention to cutting the lap joints for the first set of cabinet doors on the table saw. Oops, did I say first set? Let's just call that a little foreshadowing. Anyway, I taped a stop block on my sled for consistent laps. Then, I cleaned those laps with my router and a fluted bit for a nice flat surface. Finally, I went over the inside edges very carefully with a sharp chisel. I gathered all the pieces and took a few gentle passes with my shoulder plane, cleaning out all the rabbets and laps. I gave the door frames a gentle sanding and glued them together. I drilled and countersunk a hole in each cabinet side so I could screw the cabinets directly into the wall studs without interfering with the adjustable shelves. Then I assembled the sides of the cabinet boxes. I used clamping squares to keep everything square while I drove the screws in from assembly. With the carcasses all but fully assembled, I resawed the adjustable shelves for the interiors of the cabinets. After ordering the hinges for the project, I realized that I was going to need a face frame. So I broke down another board by hand and cross-cut it about an inch longer than the final measurements at the table saw. Then I planed all the parts for the face frame. Since the entire assembly will sit either inside the wall or against it, I drilled pocket holes in the frame parts before screwing the frame together. Then I repeated the process on both cabinets, drilling pocket holes around the carcass and attaching the face frames. With the face frames attached, I rounded over the corners with my cordless router, and then I sanded the whole assembly outside and inside. This is when I realized that my doors were the wrong size to work with the face frame. Yeah. I jointed a clean edge on the table saw, then ripped the boards to width before cross-cutting the door frame pieces to their final length. And then I planed all the door frame parts to thickness. Again. This summer broke all kinds of high temperature records. Even working in my garage, dehydration was never far away. This is survival stuff, man. This is water. It's hot. Drink or die. By this point, I can say that I've already done this. I made a pair of cabinet doors, just the wrong size. This part should go quickly and flawlessly. Right. Rip it, cross-cut, double-check my math this time. But while I'm at it, let's cut the inset door panels. From a design perspective, I wanted a solid board with continuous grain for the door panels. The widest maple my local hardware supplier stocks is only 5 to 6 inches wide. That meant my next best option was a book-matched panel, and fortunately, if that math was right, 8 1/4 inches was going to be no problem at all. With book-matched panels in hand, I took my jointer plane to the shared edge to make sure that the panels matched up perfectly without any gaps between them. I glued up the door panels just like I did with the back panels, and I put them aside to dry. I swear this should have worked. Cleaning the laps with the router worked so well the first time, I figured that I'd skip cutting the laps with the table saw as a first step. To be fair, this is one of those operations that can really be done many ways, and the router is just one way. Using double-sided tape, I lined up the door pieces to be cut. I set my edge guide and bit depth and cleaned out the laps. I flip the frame parts around and repeat the process for the other side. Do you see it yet? Then I rinse and repeat with the other set of frame parts. It should work. But it would have been a really good idea to test the first cut so I could have fixed the problems on the second set of door parts. I'm about 1/8 of an inch too deep. After a brief period of panic because I was running out of maple among other things, I realized the solution was going to be fairly easy and straightforward. I was going to fix this with a maple sandwich, kind of like a spline. I ripped a thin piece and cross-cut oversized splines at the table saw. If you ever find yourself in this position, don't do it this way. Make sure you have the correct thickness before you cross-cut anything. Then I took my stack of thin maple squares, which sounds like a really cool breakfast cereal, and I ripped them to final thickness on the bandsaw. Then I proceeded to one of the stranger lap joint glue-ups I've ever done. It looks kind of like I made a burger on a bun, but either the patty or the cheese is sliding out of the sandwich, but that's intentional. As the final step, I trimmed the joint riser flush with the door frame. About this time, a group of traveling jugglers from another planet took me to their home world while they drilled the mortises for the hinges in the door frame. They had no idea I was shooting this for YouTube and my Patreon channels, and left no evidence except those photographs of the hinge mortising jig and neatly placed hinge hardware in the mortise. With the door frames assembled and mortise for hinges, I turned my attention to sanding the door frames. I found a couple small gaps in the joints and filled them with a mix of glue and sawdust from the project. Then I sanded the door panels, eventually using my router to cut a rabbet on the back side of the door frame with a rabbeting bit. Next, I used the empty door frame as a guide to scribe a line on the door panel. Then, using the ruler on my square, I scribed a line to mark the corners of the rabbet that a round bit will never clean out. Finally, I pared away the rest of the rabbet so the door panel will fit in the frame. I trimmed the inset door panels to their final size on the bandsaw. Then I made pencil marks across the door parts before sanding everything to 120 grit. Then I masked off the glue areas with tape and trimmed it flush with a knife to protect it from finish. I was pretty sure Cindy and David's bathroom vanities were finished in some shade of shellac, and I wanted to match them as closely as possible. So I started mixing half pints of shellac with the idea that I was going to find the right one or mix my way right to it. Let's give this a real shellacking. I tested each shade of shellac on scraps of maple to find the right match and shellacked the back panel of one of the cabinets. Then, using a spray bottle with tap water, I sprayed the remaining cabinet parts to raise the grain before proceeding with the shellac. It was a good thing, too, because even after testing, that first panel came out too orange, and I ultimately chose to rag on a blonde shellac after knocking down the grain with a 220 grit sandpaper. It was easy to rag on the shellac because the carcasses were still open at the back. Also, because they were being mounted inside the wall, the area being finished was actually very small. I swear, sometimes it feels like I'm using more tape than Richard Nixon. With the shellac done, I removed the tape where the joints meet the inset panels for the back of the carcass and the door frame. Then, very carefully, I applied tape over the freshly dried shellac to protect it from glue squeeze out. Then I ran a bead of glue along all the rabbets. Finally, I was able to put the panels in place with 18-gauge brads to hold everything while the glue dried. What about wood movement? These panels are so narrow that the maximum wood movement is only about 0.05 of an inch throughout the year, so I'm not too concerned about gluing these panels in place. And much to my own surprise, this is a medicine cabinet instead of the grilled cheese I was making for lunch. Okay, I'll admit to a little personal satisfaction for the way this was coming along. Once the glue was dry enough to proceed, it was time to add the hinges. I used more of my favorite green tape as a depth guide on the drill bit, and I drilled starter holes for the hinge screws. You like the way I put the entire project in jeopardy by drilling the holes on top of the face frames? No harm was done, but it wasn't a shining example of personal brilliance. Then I screwed the hinges into the mortises before removing the tape from the fully assembled doors. Anywhere the tape was pinched between the frame and the panel, I carefully cut the tape with my craft knife and gently lifted it out with the blade tip into the carcass. Using soft close hinges was a new experience for me, and probably the one thing that created personal anxieties for me on this project. So, I was bordering on giddy as I stood the cabinet upright on my workbench and watched the door close for the first time. I did it. David and Cindy provided me with a couple of door handles that matched the new vanities they had installed. So I fashioned a simple drilling jig from scraps I had around the shop, and I clamped it to the door with another piece of scrap and back to prevent tear out. Then I drilled the holes for the handles and I screwed it in place. I repeated the sequence for the other door, and just to enjoy how awesome a job I had done, I opened and closed the door a few more times. There was only one last thing to do. I took the completed cabinets to David and Cindy's house and I placed the cabinets in the wall. I placed a level in the bottom of the cabinet and screwed the cabinets into the studs with construction screws. I put the shelf pins and shelves into both cabinets before going home and collapsing with COVID for the next week. Really. Fortunately, neither David nor Cindy got sick. Best of all, they're absolutely thrilled with the new cabinets.
Well, dear, what do you think?
Could have been worse.
Thank you for watching. Remember to leave the world a little nicer than you found it, and please like, comment, and subscribe.